South Africa's preferential procurement practices, part of the country's strategy to reverse the legacy of apartheid, are being blamed for creating a class of businessmen that pose a serious risk to the country. Now, businesses and corporates that are at the receiving end of these businessmen, middlemen suppliers known as tenderpreneurs, are pushing for public procurement reforms. The people leading the reforms want tenderpreneurs and middlemen be cut out. The changes in South Africa's procurement rules are rooted in a blueprint crafted by Kenneth Brown, a former chief procurement officer in the National Treasury who was instrumental in developing the government's early procurement reforms about a decade ago. In 2016, Brown warned about government's excessive reliance on intermediaries and middlemen suppliers. He argued that these middlemen drive up the costs without improving services or delivery outcomes. Brown estimated that weaknesses in procurement systems resulted in government losing about 40% of its annual procurement budget to fraud and artificial inflation of prices of goods and services by middlemen. Procurement fraud is a big money spinner for criminals and corrupt officials who are prepared to kill whistleblowers or anyone that stand in the way of their ill-gotten gains. One of the highly publicized cases of tender fraud involves a Transnet contract for nondescript springs, a railway locomotive component no larger than the size of a finger, which was inflated by over 4,500%. The state-owned transport and logistics company had ordered 8,000 of these springs from a middleman who bought them from an original manufacturer and then unsold them to Transnet at a heavily inflated price. The middleman bought the springs from the original manufacturer at the price of R3.20 each and then supplied them to Transnet at a price of R152 each, pocketing more than 1.2 million rand from the contract that should have cost 25,000 rand. An employee of the manufacturer who had found out that the middleman had heavily inflated the price of the springs reported the matter to Transnet. But the whistleblower set a chain of events that led to the assassination of 30-year-old Ahmad Swart, a colleague of the whistleblower who was shot 23 times in a case of mistaken identity in April 2024. 4 men were subsequently arrested for the hit. They are facing prosecution for the murder. These hitmen are linked to the so-called Big Five cartel, which is also linked to a 2.3 billion rand procurement fraud at Tembisa Hospital in Gauteng. Babita Deokaran, a whistleblower at the Gauteng Health Department, was taken out in August 2021, allegedly by members of the Big Five cartel for blowing the lid on the fraud at the hospital. Deokaran was shot 12 times. The Big Five cartel and other syndicates that looted 2.3 billion rand at Tembisa Hospital were aided by 15 people working at the hospital and the Gauteng Health Department. These officials were responsible for sourcing medical supplies, appointing suppliers, and approving payments. In many of the transactions that were identified by investigators, there is no evidence that the tenderpreneurs delivered goods to the hospital. Money simply vanished from the hospital's coffers for nothing in return, reducing its ability to provide health care to its patients, many of whom are poor South Africans. Government procurement is a lucrative business because government spends about 800 billion rands annually on goods and services, making it an obvious target for tenderpreneurs and organized crime syndicates like the Big Five cartel. During his tenure as government's chief procurement officer, Kenneth Brown had recommended that government could save billions of rands if it bought goods directly from original manufacturers instead of middlemen or tenderpreneurs. In South Africa, a tenderpreneur is a slang for a person who uses political connections, influence, or inside information to win government contracts. In many instances, the contracts are not awarded on merit or open competition. The bidding processes are usually rigged. In other words, a tenderpreneur typically secures contracts by virtue of who they know rather than what they can legitimately deliver. The rigging of tenders puts smaller legitimate businesses without political ties at a disadvantage, causing them to lose out. For a long time, Tenderpreneurs amassed huge wealth due to weak oversight, lack of transparency, and poor enforcement of procurement rules. South Africa's preferential procurement regulations compel government entities like state-owned enterprises and municipalities to comply with broad-based Black economic empowerment and localization policies. These regulations are designed to achieve two major goals. The first goal is to give Black-owned businesses preferential treatment in tenders in order to level the playing field with white-owned companies. This is intended to address historical economic injustices caused by apartheid, which prevented Black South Africans from accessing economic opportunities. The second objective of the regulations is to give local companies preferential treatment in lucrative tenders to ensure that they are not outbid by foreign companies. Localization rules are also designed to outsource a portion of government's work to local companies. In essence, the crux of BEE and localization regulations is to compel government institutions to source goods and services from middlemen. As I have already pointed out, the regulations unintentionally add a layer of costs for procuring entities. This is because the middlemen suppliers add markups to the prices of goods in order to make profits. State-owned enterprises like transport and logistics company Transnet and electricity generator and distributor Eskom have incurred huge losses because of being forced by BEE and localization regulations to buy critical goods and equipment from Black-owned suppliers and local companies. That is why these state-owned companies have pushed for procurement reforms to rein in greedy and corrupt middlemen. The reforms are led by Andile Sanqu, Transnet's chairperson, and Mteto Nyati, Eskom's chairperson. Sanqu and Nyati are respected businessmen and turnaround strategists. Both Eskom and Transnet are in the middle of implementing turnaround strategies to fix their loss-making operations and reduce or end reliance on government bailouts to stay afloat. Mteto Nyati has warned several times that Eskom, which regularly sources coal and maintenance repairs for its power stations, was being constrained from implementing its turnaround strategy by the preferential procurement regulations. In some instances, Eskom was forced to procure from middlemen and tenderpreneurs who delivered subpar coal or performed shoddy equipment repairs, often causing breakdowns to Eskom's power stations. Nyati lobbied for Eskom to be allowed to overhaul its procurement rules to bypass the middlemen and purchase critical goods and spare parts directly from original equipment manufacturers and original parts manufacturers. Transnet, the monopoly operator of freight trains, seaports, and petroleum pipelines in South Africa, has also started cutting out middlemen. The procurement rules adopted by Eskom and Transnet are a sharp departure from traditional procurement practices that aim to advance Black economic empowerment and localization rules. By cutting out the middlemen, these companies believe they will save costs, improve customer service, boost revenues, and root out entrenched inefficiencies. Transnet has gone as far as codifying its procurement reforms. The reforms are contained in a 61-page procurement manual approved by Transnet's board in September 2024. In this manual, the state-owned company expressly encourages its procurement divisions to source critical equipment directly from original manufacturers instead of middlemen. Transnet and Eskom are not the only reformers pushing back against middlemen raking in billions of rands from exploiting loopholes in South Africa's public sector procurement regulations. The Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, SAFSA, and its affiliate, South African Valve and Actuator Manufacturers Association, SAVAMA, want government to impose tougher sanctions against unethical contractors and importers that violate South Africa's localization rules. SAFSA and SAVAMA want government to impose punitive sanctions and penalties on contractors and bidders that transgress localization rules when procuring valves. On paper, South Africa has a wide range of punitive sanctions to combat transgression of localization rules, but in practice, authorities have been turning a blind eye. The transactions include disqualification from tendering, outright cancellation of awarded tenders, blacklisting from doing business with the state for up to 10 years, and forfeiture of bid or performance guarantees. In serious cases, the state can bring civil or criminal action, especially where suppliers have committed fraud or forgery. However, unethical contractors and suppliers have been getting away with installing imported cheap valves and actuators on water construction projects that require contractors to install locally produced products. Valves and actuators are used to manage and automate the flow of water, gas, and petroleum in pipelines that deliver these products to consumers. Contractors bypass localization rules by importing cheap, fully assembled products from China. This import cheating undercuts local manufacturers, worsening the deindustrialization that has been plaguing South Africa since the mid-1980s. Savama is concerned that middlemen, mostly one-man operations, are able to buy container loads of finished products and drop them off at customers' doorsteps without ever investing in the necessary infrastructure locally. This means that government contracts meant for local manufacturers are diverted to undeserving middlemen. Public sector procurement is critical to the sustainability of the valve and actuator manufacturers. It accounts for 58% of total sales, making it a critical source of revenue for the local sector. Thus, contractors that dishonestly install imported cheap valves are destroying local valve manufacturers, which can hold their own against European and US manufacturers, but cannot compete with Chinese producers. On average, Chinese valves are imported to South Africa at a price of 333 Rand per kg. Europe and the rest of the world sell valves in South Africa at a price of 2,166 Rand per kg, while South African manufacturers export valves at a price of 2,691 Rand per kg. The majority of middlemen who import cheap valves from China lack both the capital and technical know-how required to establish productive capacity in sectors such as heavy engineering. In this context, the incentive to exploit loopholes by importing finished products becomes the default option, as it provides them with a foothold in the industry without having to make the initial investment in skills and infrastructure. SAFESA's CEO-designate Tafatswa Chibanguza believes that import cheating could be addressed by closing policy loopholes that encourage wrongdoing. Chibanguza believes that procurement rules must be tightened to clearly distinguish between mere margin addition and genuine value addition. This means that state procurement policies must prioritize purchases from companies that demonstrate actual local manufacturing activity.